A judge points at the door and tells Keanu Reeves he does not belong in her courtroom. Not because he said anything, not because he did anything wrong, because of who was sitting next to him. A man no one at that courthouse had ever bothered to know. Keanu looked at the judge. He looked at the man beside him. Then he stood up quietly and walked out. 5 minutes later, he came back. And what happened next stopped every proceeding in that building. There is a courthouse on West Temple Street in downtown Los Angeles called the Stanley Mosque Courthouse. It is 11 stories of white concrete and tinted glass, the kind of building that imposes before you have reached its steps. It handles more civil cases per year than almost any courthouse in the country. Hundreds of people pass through its security lines every morning. Plaintiffs, defendants, lawyers carrying leather bags that cost more than most people's monthly rent. Witnesses who would rather be anywhere else. The lobby smells like floor wax and old paper. The escalators are slow. The hallways on the upper floors are wide enough to feel institutional and quiet enough to feel lonely. It is not a place designed for warmth. It is a place designed to produce outcomes. Judge Patricia Voss had been on the bench at Department 52 for 19 years. She had made that room run on precision. 8:15 a start. No exceptions. Nothing on the tables that had not been submitted to chambers in advance. No outbursts. No delays. No witnesses who arrived unprepared. Her reputation in the building was specific, fair, demanding, and not interested in the room's opinion of her methods. She wore the same kind of reading glasses she had worn for 20 years. She moved through her docket without ceremony. She had presided over cases involving major film studios, real estate developers, medical corporations, and a long list of people who had arrived in her courtroom believing their prominence would matter and discovered it did not. It was a Tuesday in late October. Cold fog that morning, the kind that did not burn off until noon. Keanu arrived in the parking structure of Hope Street at 8 minutes past 8. Dark jeans, a gray knit sweater, worn at the left cuff, old boots, no security, no assistant. He walked into the building through the main entrance with everyone else, got in the escalator line, and rode up to the 9th floor without anyone stopping him. Because nothing about him said he needed stopping. He was not there for himself. The man he was there with was named Walter Devlin. Walter was 63 years old. He had worked as a construction contractor for 31 years, built apartment foundations in the San Fernando Valley, poured concrete in Riverside County, supervised framing crews in Burbank. He had never missed a payment on his house until the winter 2.5 years ago, when a structural dispute with a developer pulled him into litigation he had not prepared for and could not afford. The developer's name was Clearfield Properties. They had 4 partners, 6 attorneys on retainer, and a standard practice of outlasting contractors who could not absorb the cost of a prolonged legal fight. They had done it 11 times before Walter. They would do it again. Walter had hired an attorney. Then he could not pay the attorney. Then he had tried to represent himself, which the court permitted and did not recommend. He had shown up to 3 prior hearings, wearing the same dark slacks and a button-down shirt that had seen better years, carrying a folder of documents he had organized himself. Across a table from 3 people in suits who had been trained at institutions that did not offer night classes. He was not a stupid man. He had spent 3 decades reading contracts, managing crews, staying ahead of county inspectors. He understood what had been done to him. He simply did not know the language the system used to say it. He had grown up in a house in Pacoima that his father had built on weekends over the course of 2 years. His father was a pipe fitter. His mother worked dispatch for a logistics company. The house was small and it was theirs, and Walter had never once thought that the law was something that did not apply to him, or that the system would look at a man who had worked honestly for 30 years and decide he did not deserve to be heard. Then the 3rd hearing happened, and the 4th, and Walter started to understand something about the system he had trusted without examining. He did not become angry. That surprised people who knew him. He became quiet, the way a man becomes quiet when he is deciding how much he still believes in something. He had met Keanu 2 years earlier on a job site in Silver Lake. A mutual friend, a conversation that lasted longer than expected. A phone number exchanged and actually used. They had met for coffee 6 times since then. Keanu had asked the previous week if he could come to the hearing. Walter had said he did not need to. Keanu had said he knew. He came anyway. They sat in the second row of the gallery in Department 52 at 8:14. 1 minute early. The room was already quiet. There were 8 other people in the gallery. 2 attorneys in the front row with tablets and folders. A woman in her 50s taking notes by hand. A young man in a tie that was slightly too short, watching the door like he was waiting for someone. The bailiff brought the case to order at 8:15 exactly. Clearfield's lead attorney was a man named Graham Sato. He wore a charcoal suit and had the particular ease of a person who had won the last several things he had attempted. He nodded at his colleagues. He did not look at Walter. Walter sat at the respondent's table, alone, with his folder. The hearing began. It concerned a motion to exclude certain contractor records Walter had submitted. Records that Walter believed demonstrated the dispute was manufactured, that the structural fault had been present before his crew arrived, that Clearfield had known this and brought suit anyway. It was a document question, a procedural question, the kind of question that should have had a clear answer and had been made complicated by people for whom complication was a professional service. Graham Sato spoke for 11 minutes. He was precise and fluid. He referenced 6 prior rulings and cited 2 federal standards by case name. He concluded by arguing that the documents were inadmissible because Walter had not submitted them through proper channels in the required window. Walter stood. He said the documents were late because he had not known about the submission window. Aside, he had asked the clerk's office and been given incorrect information about the deadline. He had the email. Graham Sato said the email was irrelevant. Hooge Voss looked at Walter's folder. She asked if he had the email. He said yes. She told him to approach. He brought it. She read it for 45 seconds. Then she looked up. She sighed the document window had closed. She said the clerk's incorrect guidance was regrettable but did not constitute grounds for an extension under the applicable rule. She sighed she was sorry, and she said it in the way people say it when they are not particularly sorry. Then her eyes moved past Walter to the gallery, to the second row, to Keanu. She recognized him. The room registered her recognition the way rooms always do. A collective stillness, a redirected attention. Her expression did not change, but her voice did. She sighed. Is this person here in support of the respondent? Walter said yes. She sighed. This is a civil proceeding. Gallery support is permitted only for parties to the case. Does this individual have a formal role? Walter said he was a friend. She sighed. If he does not have a formal role, he needs to wait outside. Keanu looked at her, then at Walter. Then he said quietly, "Of course." He stood. He straightened his sweater. He walked to the door, held it for a woman who was entering, and stepped out into the hall. The door closed. Walter stood at the respondent's table and looked at his folder. The hearing continued. The records were excluded. Graham Sato made 2 additional motions, both granted. The next hearing date was set for December 11th. Walter wrote it in the margin of a document he was now not sure meant anything. The hearing was over in 22 minutes. Walter gathered his folder and walked out. Keanu was in the hallway, standing near the window at the far end, looking at the fog over the city. He turned when the door opened. He did not ask how it went. He could see how it went. He sighed. "Can I make a call before we leave?" Walter said he was not in a hurry. Keanu stepped a few feet away. He pulled out his phone. He spoke for less than 3 minutes. His back slightly turned. Walter watched a woman push a stroller past the elevator bank. A clerk walked by with a box of files. Then Keanu came back. He said, "Let's go back in." Walter said the hearing was over. Keanu said, "I know." What happened in the next 45 minutes was not what Judge Voss had planned for her Tuesday. At 9:07, the doors of Department 52 opened again. Walter came in first. Then Keanu. Then a woman named Catherine Osei, a civil litigation attorney who had argued before the California Court of Appeal 14 times, and won 11 of them. She wore a navy blazer and carried nothing except a legal pad and a pen, and she moved to the front of the room the way people move when they know exactly where they are going. Graham Sato's associate leaned over and said something into his ear. Catherine Osei introduced herself to the clerk and asked to be recognized on a matter related to the morning's proceeding. Judge Voss, who was reviewing something at her bench, looked up. She sighed. This matter was closed. Catherine said she was aware of that. She said there was a substantive error she believed warranted the court's attention, and she was requesting 3 minutes. Judge Voss studied her for a moment. Then she said, 3 minutes. Catherine walked to the respondent's table, where Walter sat again, and she laid her legal pad down. She said the court had excluded records on the basis of a missed submission deadline. She cited the respondent had received written guidance from the clerk's office specifying a different deadline, guidance that contradicted the court's actual rules. She cited this was not a clerical inconvenience. It was a due process question. She cited the relevant case. She cited it by name, by year, by the exact principle it established. Then she cited a second case, then a third. She cited Walter Devlin had submitted documentation in good faith reliance on information provided by an officer of this court. She cited excluding that documentation on those grounds would represent a procedural outcome that the Ninth Circuit had explicitly found to be reversible. She cited, I am requesting a continuance and reconsideration of the exclusion. Graham Sato said Catherine Osei had not been party to this case and had no standing to make the request. Catherine said she had been retained as co-counsel at 8:54 this morning. She had the paperwork. She produced it. Judge Boss looked at the paperwork. She looked at Walter. She looked at Keanu in the gallery. Something shifted in the room. It was not loud. It was the quiet kind of shift. The kind you feel before anyone says anything, when the weight of what is actually happening becomes visible to everyone at once. Judge Boss set the paperwork down. She sighed. Mr. Devlin, did you receive written communication from this court's clerk office specifying a submission deadline that differed from the court's actual rules? Walter said yes. She sighed. Do you have that communication with you? He said yes. She said, bring it. He brought it. She read it for 90 seconds. She read it again. Her expression was the expression of someone who has found an error they would have preferred not to find. She sighed. I'm granting the continuance. The exclusion will be revisited at the December hearing. Co-counsel's appearance is accepted. Graham Sato began to say something about the established record. Judge Voss said, noted counselor. He stopped. After the room had cleared, Judge Voss remained at her bench. The bailiff was filing something near the side door. The clerk was on the phone. She called Walter back. She said she wanted to say something to him before he left. He came to the front of the room. She sighed. What I did this morning was technically correct. The rule is the rule, but technically correct is not the same thing as just. I want you to know the difference is not lost on me. Walter looked at her for a moment. Then he said, I appreciate that. She said, your attorney is very good. He said, she was not my attorney this morning. There was a silence. She sighed. No, I suppose she wasn't. In the hallway, Keanu was waiting at the same window. Walter came out and stood beside him. He said, you didn't have to do that. Keanu said, I know. Walter said, that attorney, she is not cheap. Keanu sighed. No. Walter said, I can't. Keanu said, I know. Don't. They stood at the window. The fog had begun to thin. Somewhere below, on Temple Street, a truck was backing up, and its signal was going. Walter said, why? Keanu was quiet for a moment. Then he said, because I sat in rooms where someone could have said something and didn't. And I remember what that felt like. I don't want to be that person. He paused. Also, you build good foundations. I've seen the work. Walter said, you came to my job site once. Keanu said, I pay attention. The December 11th hearing lasted 40 minutes. Catherine Osei presented the excluded records in full. She walked the court through the timeline. When the work began, when the structural issue first appeared in Clearfield's internal documentation, what that documentation said, and when Clearfield had filed suit, she presented 3 exhibits. She cross-referenced the dates. She asked Graham Sato, during her rebuttal, how a structural defect that appeared in Clearfield's own records 14 months before Walter's crew arrived on site could be attributed to Walter's crew. A side, it was a matter of interpretation. She said, whose interpretation? He said, the defendant's engineers. She said, were those engineers employed by Clearfield at the time they conducted their assessment? A pause. Yes. She said, nothing further. Judge Voss considered the case for 8 days. Her ruling came back on December 19th. 11 pages. She found in favor of Walter Devlin. She found that Clearfield Properties had initiated litigation against the contractor using a structural report they had reason to believe was inaccurate. She used the phrase inequitable conduct. She used it twice. The case was dismissed. Legal costs were awarded to Walter. Walter got the ruling on a Wednesday morning. He sat at his kitchen table in Pacoima and read it twice. His wife, Rosaria, read it over his shoulder. She had worked as an administrative coordinator at a school district for 22 years and had not once asked him to settle or to stop or to walk away. And when she finished reading, she put her hand flat on the kitchen table the way she did when she was trying not to cry. He called Keanu that afternoon. Keanu said, "I heard." Walter sighed. "Did Catherine call you?" Keanu said, "She might have." Walter said, "I need to pay her." Keanu said, "She has been paid." Walter was quiet. Keanu said, "Don't." Walter sighed. "I am going to do something for you someday." Keanu said, "Build something that matters." That is enough. The months that followed were not immediately easy. Winning a civil case and recovering from one are not the same event. The legal fees Walter had accumulated before Catherine arrived did not disappear because the judgment had. He had drawn down his savings. It had a second mortgage that had not been in his original plans for 63. Two members of his crew had left during the litigation because the uncertainty had lasted too long. It started over with 3 people, smaller jobs, a bathroom remodel in Eagle Rock, a garage conversion in Glendale, work he had not taken in 15 years, not because it was beneath him, but because his business had grown past the need for it. Now, it had not grown past the need for it. It did not talk about the case. He did not position himself as someone who had been wronged and won. He showed up, he did the work, he came home. In February, 6 weeks after the ruling, he got a call from a project manager at a housing nonprofit in the Northeast Valley, an organization that built affordable units for working families. They needed a foundation contractor. They had a timeline and a budget that had a margin of about nothing. They had heard he was reliable. He took the job. The project broke ground in April. 8 units on a vacant lot in Arleta. Walter poured the foundation himself on the days the crew needed an extra set of hands. It was 63 years old, and he worked in the cold without complaint. And on the third day, the project manager, a young woman named Deja, who wore a hard hat a size too large for her, asked him how long he had been doing this. He said, 33 years? She said, "And you still pour concrete yourself?" He sighed, "I pour concrete because I am good at it. Being good at something does not stop mattering because you have been doing it a long time." She wrote that down. She was not taking notes on the project. She was taking notes on him. The 8 units were completed in September, a small ceremony, families moving in, children running the length of apartments that were theirs for the first time. Walter stood at the back and watched and did not say anything. "Deja came to find him." She said, "Those families are going to live in something you built." He said, "A lot of people built it." She said, "You know what I mean." He did. Aside, "My father built our house. Took him 2 years, weekends and evenings. I was 4 when he started and 6 when he finished. I grew up in a house my father made with his hands. I always thought that was the most important thing a person could do. Make something that other people live inside." She was quiet. Aside, "That is what this work is. That is what it has always been. Courts don't change that. Bad actors don't change that. It is still the same work." A writer from a construction trade publication came to interview Walter that winter. He gave her 2 hours. It talked about the Clearfield case briefly and without drama. He talked about the nonprofit project at greater length. He talked about his father. At the end of the interview, she asked him about Keanu Reeves. It was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "He is a person who noticed something that wasn't right and did something about it, without making it about himself. That is not common. You would think it would be common, but it is not." She asked if they were still in touch. He said, "We have coffee." Yes. She asked what they talked about. Aside. "The work mostly." He asks about the nonprofit. I ask about his. We talk about our fathers. He lost his when he was young. There is a particular way 2 people understand each other when they have both been building something without their fathers watching. The article ran in March. It was not about Keanu. It was about Walter, and what 3 decades in construction means to a man who chose it on purpose and stayed. Several people sent it to Keanu. He did not comment publicly. He did not say anything about the courthouse. He did not take credit for Catherine's work or for the outcome. or for any of it. He had been back on a film set since January and the work was what it was, and he went home at the end of each day the same way he always had. You do not know, sitting with this story, what I find most remarkable about it. It would be easy to say, it is the outcome, the ruling, the justice served, the foundation poured in Arleta by a man who had almost been driven out of the work he had spent his life doing. Those things matter. They are worth naming. But what I keep returning to is something smaller. It is the moment in the hallway when Walter asked why, and Keanu said, because I sat in rooms where someone could have said something and didn't, and I remember what that felt like. Most of us have sat in those rooms. Most of us know the particular weight of watching something wrong happen and saying nothing because saying something was costly or complicated or not our problem. And we know what we feel like afterward. Not guilty, exactly, but lesser. Like we left something behind in the room that we have not been able to recover. What Keanu did was not complicated. He made a phone call. He sat in a gallery. He stood up when he was asked to leave, and he came back with someone who knew the language the room was using. It was not the hero of the story. Walter was the person who showed up to 4 hearings alone with a folder and did not stop. Catherine was the person who won it. Deja was the person who looked at a 63-year-old man pouring his own concrete and understood what that meant. Keanu was the person who noticed and did something and left before the applause. I am not sure we talk enough about what that particular choice costs, or what it looks like in a person who makes it habitually, without announcement, as if it is simply the obvious thing to do. I think about it more than I probably should. This story is fictional, inspired by Keanu Reeves' well-known reputation for generosity, humility, and quiet acts of support toward people who have no expectation of receiving them. If something in it stayed with you, drop a comment and tell me what you took from it. Not what you thought of the story, what you took from it. There is a difference, and I am always curious about the difference. If you know someone who is in the middle of their own lone fight, who has been showing up alone to rooms where the other side has 3 people in suits, share this with them. Not because a story fixes anything, because sometimes knowing someone else has been there and made it through is the thing that keeps you going. One more week. Subscribe if this is the kind of story you want more of. I try to bring a new one every week. See you in the next one.